Hello everyone. So I'm recording this video as a sort of process piece for my wife. For this Christmas I made her this poster for Captain America. I'm also going to show a piece I did for my son, but I just want to say I love you, and we're going to take a look kind of at what this is, what went into it. I will say that I didn't record, sadly, a video of me making a piece for my son. I only recorded the one for Tessa, and I had to speed it up to something ridiculous like 150% speed because otherwise it was going to be over 10 hours long. I actually did multiple pieces, which is one of the first things that you saw. Is I was going to do Thor and Captain America, but eventually I decided to just go with one character because I felt like I could do more with it. I didn't have to be too illustrative. I kind of wanted to do something that was very comic booky. I am pre-recording this, but this video shouldn't go live until after she's already seen the final piece. But I did go ahead and get it framed, but I wanted it to look like maybe not cover art for a comic, but something that you might find as like a carpet page in a comic. For those wondering, a carpet page is sort of like a big, single page that fills everything, and the idea was to really sort of center on Cap. It's one of her favorite Avengers. Oh yeah, you'll see me writing a whole bunch. I knew I was recording this, so some of those are going to be messages to you. There were actually a couple pieces I missed, so I think the whole video, when I originally recorded it, with the other piece included, was something like 15 hours. And I ended up cutting out that other piece. But let me talk a little bit about the art. I'm not sure she's going to watch any further into the video because it's going to just be a lot of me drawing, unless she's super committed to watching me draw on all the scary process stuff. So this right here, I recommend to any new artist. So the red lines there are me figuring out the rule of thirds, which is basically you divide the page into 3 sections vertically and horizontally. And your focal point should be at the points where those lines connect. You should have 2 or 3 of them if you're making a scene, and they should sort of have a hierarchy. And that's sort of what that was. That was me figuring out. This is me figuring out how I even want Cap to be posed, because I kind of had this idea, sort of first Avengers movie style, of how I wanted to have Cap in the scene of fighting aliens or in a destroyed city. And so that's me figuring out like what pose I wanted him to be in. And I looked up a bunch of poses of him throwing a shield. I knew I wanted that sort of action thing going on. After I sort of started with him just standing around, I was like, it doesn't seem very cool. Not really worthy of a carpet page, so let's go ahead and actually have him throw the shield. So I had to do a whole bunch of sort of looking up of different ways people throw discus, basically. And I will admit, I am not a professional artist. This is something I typically do for fun. Very rarely do I actually get paid to do this. Figuring out hands, because hands are complicated. But my roughs tend to be very, very rough, especially when I'm doing a scene, because I want to... I was so happy when I finally got the thumb right. They tend to be so very, very rough because I know that I'm going to have to go back and iterate over and over again. And so my roughs are really just like, can I get things essentially into position? They don't have to be perfect. I just need to know where that thing's going to be, because I know I'm just going to end up erasing it. And the nice thing about digital is that nothing's permanent, which is also sort of the pitfall of it, is that if you're a newer artist, I would actually recommend against digital. Especially with drawing. One, because it's kind of expensive. You have to buy, things for it. This is using ClipStudio, so, it's a relatively cheap program if you just want the home version. I recently found out there's another program called, I think it's Krito, that has a whole bunch of cool brushes. I'm still kind of getting used to it, not on many videos on that yet, but my point being that you can't really do a lot of this work with a mouse. You need to have like a tablet of some kind, and even not one with a screen, but you need something with a stylus. And so that's kind of expensive. If you're starting out, I would just say pencil and paper. Pretty much any pencil, any paper to kind of get started. I would not invest in these things until you really know that that's something you want to do. Also, this is actually a really cool feature of ClipStudio is they have a perspective ruler, and it's something that I wish every other drawing program out there would adopt. There are some wonky things with it that I don't like it's hard to go back to a different perspective ruler, but it allows you to quickly hash in things in perspective, which for this is great, just to kind of get those block buildings in there and have them actually be in the correct perspective. This is the unromantic part of doing this kind of work, which is these are going to be windows. So what I'm doing here, and this is again a nice thing about digital, is you can just kind of copy and paste until you have sort of a window pattern that you like, or whatever it is that you like. Make as many of them as you want, and then just kind of keep going with it. And then you can copy it out and put it in perspective by using basically the transform tool. And you'll see me do that here in a second. Again, this is like at 150 speed, so it's super fast, and I'm sorry if I'm talking fast to kind of try to keep up with it, but what you'll see is I'll transform and just try to line up the lines of the transform to the building. And that is essentially how you make sure that those windows are in perspective. That's it. They're super easy to do, and since I knew these buildings were going to be in the background, I didn't have to go see, and that's me having trouble using one ruler versus the other. So here I am again cheating and just making a bunch of lines, and then I'm just going to transform them into perspective. You know, if you understand perspective, it's actually pretty easy to cheat that stuff out, and just kind of go with it. But again, I knew these buildings were going to be in the background, so they didn't have to be super detailed. The one exception is that one that's a little bit closer to us in the frame on the far right side there. I do end up detailing that one out quite a bit, as you probably saw from the final drawing. There's I wanted battle damage on it, so that took a little bit more. But you know, even if you have this kind of tool, yes, that's where I missed it. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Where you can see I enlarged Cap even a little bit more to kind of put him center frame. I don't know what I wrote there. I think that was too fast for me to catch, but you know, and you can see the initial drawing sort of under here, or sort of my refined version of it. Again, it's really just to kind of get an idea. Sorry, to go back to perspective, one of the things that is still important is understanding what perspective is before you start futzing with it too much, because you still need to know sort of what's going on there. And it's not so much like, yeah, sure, you could put a whole bunch of blocks in perspective and arrange them, but when things have to interact with other things in perspective and you don't have an understanding of it, you might kind of hit into a pitfall where things look like they're closer to you than they should be, or further than they should be, or they have a weird interaction where there's a weird overlap of like something that's closer is overlapping something that should be even closer, despite the fact of how it's interacting with something else. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. My understanding of perspective mostly comes from an architecture class I took when I was in college, because in architectural drawing, or in drafting, in the class that I took, we went over basically drawing a building in perspective from an actual building plan. So you had to learn how to go from this sort of flat layout plan that indicates, you know, heights and stuff. It was what they call like a plan map and an elevation map, which shows you how high things are. And then you had to take that and build a perspective drawing, which is really cool, but it's really complicated. And the nice thing is when you're kind of drawing for fantasy stuff, or, you know, doing something like this, you don't have to be quite as nitpicky as they were there. Like, I don't have to make sure that doors are the, you know, perfect height. But you still should kind of have an understanding of buildings and things. So, and yeah, here I am doing another overdrawing. For something this big and this complex, I surrendered myself to the fact that I was going to have to do multiple overdrawings. I also wanted to do a fair amount of this, I don't want to say as much as I could, because I could have done the perspective freehand, but I wanted to do a lot of it freehand. I wanted me to be in the piece, and that's obviously because it's for my wife. I wanted to have me in there. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to call it showing off of skill, but more of just like, you know, when she looks at it or sees it, I don't know where she's going to hang it, or if she's going to hang it. Maybe she'll throw it in a closet somewhere. But I wanted that to be in there, to be like, no, really, I drew this, and she doesn't get a chance because, again, it's a long process, and I think any artist out there can commiserate that, like, you know, people often don't want to watch you draw, and it's not because they don't want to see how the sausage is made. Some people love seeing other people draw. I love watching other artists draw, and it's mostly because I get to learn so much from just their method. Like, what do they do first? How do they do it? How do they think of shapes? You know, I have the way that I do it, but, you know, it's really great. But, you know, to a layman, you know, somebody who doesn't draw or even draw quite this well, I don't expect they'll necessarily get a lot out of it. So I really wanted to have that, like, no, these are all the lines, and also here's the total proof if you really want to sit around for an hour and listen to me jibba jabba about drawing. You can do that. So let me talk a little bit about the costume. So the costume is heavily influenced by MCU. So I'm sorry for you, you know, people who are real big on just the straight comic version of Cap. I am not a huge Cap fan, but this is not a piece for me. And so I borrowed pretty heavily. There are obviously some changes. The glove's pretty similar. The forearm is very different. The helmet, I think, is almost identical to some of the MCU stuff. And I think I even make some edits later when I'm fixing some things to make it even more MCU-esque. And there were some things with the color that I don't think I quite hit exactly the way that they are in either the comics or the MCU. But I think overall it's mostly MCU inspired. So it's not a specifically from anywhere, but it's definitely Cap. This alien hand, I think in the end, I'm fine that it's there. I think that I probably could have rendered it better. And this is sort of a symptom of eventually have to call stuff done. Otherwise this would never have been done, and I would have been working on it, you know, far into next year. But I think I'm okay with it, but also I know it's not the focal point. Like, people are going to spend a long time looking at that hand, probably. The more interesting part is Cap and sort of what's going on in the background and things. Despite the fact that it's in the foreground, you know, it looks like an alien's being hit by a shield. So here, kind of noodling in the car. That car, it's interesting because, like, you know, when you do a scene like this, and it was kind of filters in with the sort of the architecture thing, is you still want your background stuff to look like it's the right size. So in this case, Cap is much closer than the car. He's jumping off of something. It's, you know, unclear where he jumped into the frame from, probably from the right side or, you know, right bottom of the frame. But you want to make sure that, you know, if I had made that car as small as it had been in the original sketch, it would have looked really weird. Because he would be so, at this scale, he'd be so much larger than it. And you really want to make things feel like, you know, they're part of the world. That brick wall, by the way, is totally going to die. I'm going to get rid of it at some point. Or at least I end up putting more stuff in the background to make it fit. Because I started to have some issues with that sort of bottom junk garbage stuff down there. So yeah, now here, this is the part where we kind of get into minutia. The thing is that the further away things are in a frame to what you're looking at, the less they sort of matter to detail out. In fact, you kind of shouldn't detail them out, because when you do, it distracts and it looks strange to the viewer. You've probably noticed that if something's far away, you have trouble, you know, understanding exactly what it is you're looking at. The farther something is, the less detail your eye picks up. And so when you're drawing, you kind of have to mimic that a little bit. You know, it's real easy to slip into, oh, I can put this at 600 pixels per inch, and so I can put like the smallest details so far away. You know, don't do that. especially in comic drawings. If you ever look at like a comic book page and you see buildings in the background, a lot of times they're just outlines with like some little indicator lines for like windows and things, but you can't see the filigree on the lentils and things like. Don't do that to yourself. Nobody's going to really be looking for it anyway, unless you're trying to exhibit it as a highly detailed work, that people can ooh and ah over, like some sort of grandmaster or something like that. But if you're starting out, or even if you're just kind of interested in drawing or doing this kind of work, then I would say spend your time where it makes sense. The time where it makes sense is probably going to be in stuff in the foreground. And since I already have Cap, the shield, and kind of the debris, this stuff, it makes sense to have some sort of semblance. Like, you should be able to tell that a window is shattered or something from this distance, but you don't necessarily need to see what kind of coffee mug that person uses. Don't need to do that. And you can even see in like one of the windows I put a little table where it's been busted out. That's that sort of left higher part where I kind of broke the window out. There's a little table in there, and I also knew that this was going to kind of be like an apartment building. So some people have blinds, some people have drapes. It's actually an awful lot of windows now that I think about it for an apartment building. But I'll also admit, I have never been to New York, which is the idea was to kind of do a New York-ish kind of thing off of the first Avengers movie. So maybe this kind of building exists in New York. I've seen pictures of buildings in New York that look sort of like this. So that was just kind of my take on it. And so here, since I knew smoke was going to be in front of these windows, I actually don't detail them as much. So you can see I'm flipping off the background just so I can kind of see what I actually drew and what's kind of going to kind of be in the final that isn't in my sketch. And because smoke obscures, I didn't want to super detail those windows, because if I had, you'd have these like super obvious windows coming through the smoke, which is strange and not, it's a comic book, so it's not supposed to be real anyway, but it would be even less real if I did that kind of thing. At this point, I was kind of taking a mental break. I will say that when I was drawing this, it wasn't all in one go. Obviously, it was over 15 hours. It was many small goes. I do not do this for a living, as I said. I have another job, and at the time work was a little bit slow, and so I would spend small bits of time when I wasn't actively doing something else doing this. So it was like 20 minutes maybe here or there, a lot of them after work and stuff like that when I had time in the evenings. So I had to reset up the perspective. Like I said, the weird thing with ClipStudio Pro is that once you do a perspective ruler, if you want to do another one, because something in the background is going to have slightly different vanishing points, it gets weird when you try to turn that ruler and try to jump between one or two. I'm sure there's a way to do it. I just don't know how. So it was easier for me to just build a new ruler. And so in this case, this building is a little bit more complex. I gave it these sort of balconies every so often. I imagined it more as like an office building that had lots of windows, that had these like, sort of extended, maybe not even a balcony, but just like an extended piece of it that comes off. I'm sure there's an architecture term and somebody's gonna, if I ever get rich and famous for doing this stuff, they'll yell at me because I didn't know the term. But in this case, I will say that I wanted to draw the whole building and then damage it, and the advantage to that is that I knew where everything was, and so I could kind of plan if a section of it had blown off, I could have it hanging off or something like that. I don't think it's necessary. I think if you're really good at drawing architecture and you have a really good eye and mind for it, you don't have to do that. But I wanted to in this case because I am not an architecture person. I'm a layman at best, and so I wanted to kind of draw everything in and then go back and blow it up. Which actually kind of helped to draw the whole thing because I could figure out where the like the struts and things, and this is me actually marking out like that's the part of the building that's going to go. And because I had the perspective lines in there, I knew exactly sort of like where the breaks were going to be. The other nice thing is I knew exactly how far, which is kind of what I'm doing here, is I knew how far the floor could possibly extend before it would break off, right? Like, you shouldn't have something that would extend outside of the building unless that building has a really weird design. And so here I am doing sort of all the ruined stuff. I did look up a lot of pictures of sort of broken buildings, buildings that had been bombed, buildings that had collapsed, just to kind of get a feel for what they look like. You know, again, I'm not super detailing. I don't need to know exactly what's in that office building to be able to do this, but I need to be able to convey that general sense of this is what buildings look like when part of them is exploded or fallen apart. And this is kind of where that, like, understanding how things work is really helpful as an artist, which is something I think that surprises a lot of people. I think a lot of people say, you know, well, artists just kind of draw pretty things, and they don't really have to understand how things are put together. And it's like, well, I mean, sure, if I was a pure illustrator and I was just like, you know, drawing ladies on a lake or something like that, you know, I may not really need to understand how that works, but you know, it helps if I'm drawing a Bond-Dot building to know that, you know, in these sort of high-rise buildings, if they're made out of concrete, that concrete has rebar through it. That rebar, if an explosion happens, it'll get exposed, you know, those kinds of things. Also, if there's an explosion, it's going to shatter the windows of the building, and it's going to shatter the windows of the building across the street. Those kind of things, which I think sometimes get overlooked, not necessarily by artists, but I think, you know, certainly not by very talented artists, people who are way far beyond me, but I think by sometimes people who criticize the art community or don't understand the art community. I think that's certainly something that comes up sometimes. Understanding science and paying attention to science and others, and really almost every other subject of sort of physical existence is actually really important for doing this kind of work. If you're interested in doing sort of comic books and things like that and character design. Yeah, so here I am sort of fixing, because I realized there was going to be a whole bunch of blank space there. And so what I ended up doing is sort of putting like a crater back there, and some just other, yeah, there goes that wall, which I replaced with a crater because it was more interesting. And then there's that like little net, which is a little hard to see now, but it'll be a little more clear when I color it in. In a lot of these cities, bigger cities, sometimes they'll put up these sort of plastic nets to mark places off. And so that's kind of what that's supposed to be, is sort of like one of those caution nets, telling people to stay out. And so yeah, cars. Now, I admit, I am not great at drawing cars. I think every car I draw comes out like this. I wasn't going for a specific type of car. I was literally going for something that somebody could look at and just go, that's a car. Which I would say I accomplished. But it looks like an older, yeah, here, doot, Windows, done. You know, even with cars, you know, or really any sort of man-made object, and this is something that's worth thinking about. Yeah, and then I end up only using half of these. I just kind of dotted windows. Originally, I was actually thinking of putting in all the windows, and then I was just like, well, it's so far back there, I should just dot them in. But like with cars, you know, I think if you look at a child's drawing of a car, you'll see like the different windows and things, but what you don't always see is like a lot of cars have sort of a curve around the window to where the window is, because you'll have like the little plastic part that the window sits in. You know, whether they have a actually, now I just thought of it, I didn't put any of the heater lines on the back window. That was silly of me. I probably should have. Too late. It's printed. Sorry, hun. But you know, like the steering wheel, and you gotta have, you know, how the door actually sits in comparison to the steering wheel, and like all these like little tiny things that I think the more you draw, you know, the more that you can kind of autopilot some of this stuff. and again, I'm not great at cars, so I actually have to think about it when I draw those. Oh yeah, this alien ship, which didn't make it into the final, but I did so many like drafts where it's like, I'll put a giant alien ship, and it just ended up looking like an iron or something. Like, I couldn't get it right, and I just ended up just being like, I'm not doing that. I'll just do these tiny little alien ships that are flying across the city. It'll be better. And it was better. And life was good. Yeah, I think that's the thing is, you know, the more you draw, the more you start, especially when you start really using your visual memory to think about how things are put together in the real world, you get a better sense of how to draw them. And that's kind of an important part of just, you know, being an artist, is sort of paying attention, especially if you want to do stuff that, you know, mimics in some way real life. You know, if you're an abstract artist, or even if you do a lot of abstraction as an artist, some illustrators do, like, you know, we're talking about like children's books and things. It may not be necessary to know all the ins and outs, but a lot of those things look so lifelike because they do understand how these work. And so I threw in the gradient. That's basically, you know, sky versus the sort of dust dirt of the bottom. This is really just to give me a base color to work off of. Kind of important, and for people who do color theory, immediately understand why, which is colors look different depending upon what color is next to other colors. It's actually a huge weird thing that the human eye does. So you actually have to be kind of careful about what colors you put next to other colors, because they bleed into each other based on your eye, and so they'll look darker or lighter or even a different color. That's where you get that like, is the dress gold or blue sort of controversy came up. So things like that. But this is just me laying in base color. A lot of these changed kind of as I went, just based on either research or just the fact that, you know, Cap has very particular colors and you have to make them look the correct way. I will say that in the end, I don't do a ton of color. It's something that I'm working on. It's definitely sort of like one of my I don't want to necessarily call it my weak point, but it's not something I'm quite as strong at. And the end result of this particular piece did come off as a little more Saturday morning cartoon, but I'm actually really okay with that in this case. I kind of wanted it to feel vibrant, especially since it's going to be, you know, possibly something that gets hung up or shown somewhere. I wanted it to have some of that level of interest, but yeah, definitely. If you're somebody who's new to color, just start playing around with them until you get used to them. You know, some people are amazing at this. Comic book colorists are unbelievable people, and there are a lot of different artists who do a lot of very different things. I'm definitely more of a line person. I love lines, and I have no doubt that if I had sent this to like a professional colorist, I would have been blown away. But the goal was for me to do it all and not hire somebody else to do it. So that was kind of where I went. And, you know, Cat being sort of the main piece, it was kind of the first place that I started, was getting his colors right. Getting him in the right spot and making it a little bit more interesting. So testing him out, you know, some places dark blue, some places not. I also wanted to make it look like, you know, he'd actually been in battle. It wasn't just like, oh yeah. I will also say that I often don't work in a ton of layers, but this one you'll see my layer count just like build and build and build. And the reason I don't like working in a lot of layers is because it's easy to get lost, and I'm sure, despite the fact that this is at a crazy high speed, you'll probably see points where it's just like, what is he doing right now? And that's straight up just because I got lost in layers. And it's easy to do when you have so many of them. It just is. So yeah, I knew my light source was kind of upper left, so that building is covered in glass, which it looks like it probably is. You'd have a high reflection off that side of the building. So that's kind of what's going on there. You also notice that a lot of these buildings for the flats, I am just kind of picking colors from the bottom and then just covering it, and that's because when, you know, as things travel through space, they tend to get a little bit more blue. There's an environmental effect where things get blue-gray the further they are from your eye when you're outside during the day. And I had this sort of ground color, the sort of ground gradient, and so I just kind of picked a color about where I assumed the base of that building would be. Closer things are going to be more darker and brown, and further things will get more close to that blue color. And so that's kind of, and then I would just color the entire building that color and then come back, and if I needed to alter it, I could alter it for shadows and things like that. Beautiful green car. I feel like I missed an opportunity to put some sort of Captain America car reference there. Now I'm thinking about it, but I don't think there's a lot I can do about that. So again, just I knew where my light source was, so now I'm kind of throwing in some very generic shadow stuff. Again, coloring is not my strong suit, so this color part is like, at this point, let's see, we're at the 31 minute mark, and this video is about an hour long. So we're talking like I spent half of the time on this particular piece just on the color, which is insane. I'm sure colorists are looking at this like, why, man? Like, why are you not doing this and this and this? And the reason is because it's just not my strong suit, guys. Back off. Purple aliens. Wanted to make sure that it didn't get confused with something else. I didn't want, you know, anybody thinking that's a Ninja Turtle. Plus, when you're doing color, it is also important to just think of how different colors play against other colors. So the car is green. Green is made up of yellow and blue. Captain America is red, white, and blue, but mostly blue. It's predominantly blue. The hand of the alien is purple, which is red and blue. So all of those colors play relatively well together. Red and green do not, but they're what are called complementary colors, so they sit across each other from the color spectrum. But the red is on Captain America's shield, which I'm actually okay sort of standing out against the green because it's in front of it anyway. So that kind of overlap isn't necessarily problematic. So, you know, these are just all, and granted, I'm not saying my reasonings on all of these are correct. I'm just saying these are the ways that I thought about them when I was doing them. Oh, this I actually love. I love how this came out, and thank you ClipStudio for having a default gradient for this. So this is just another smoke cloud, and I was like, oh, what do I want to do? What color do I want to make it? And so here I'm using a layer mask, which I love masks, especially for when I'm doing color, because they basically allow you to only show a certain section. And yeah, this like sunset thing, bam, that thing, oh man, it looks so good. And I did the same thing for that bottom one, because the idea, right, like, you know, if you were to draw, or even paint, I would actually say in this case paint, if you were to paint realistic smoke, you know, and you have like an explosion or a high fire, a lot of the light from the fire would bounce off the smoke, and so you get these sort of hot highlights coming off. And then as the smoke moved further away from it, you would have less of those highlights and more of just, you know, smoke, like sort of black color. For like non-campfire smoke, bad smoke, like oil smoke or you know, car tire smoke. And so with comics, there's a lot of I mean, they're cheats. They're straight up cheats. But one of the things that they do is they simplify the effect of stuff to make it interesting visually, but not necessarily take over the piece. And in this case, that's basically what I did, is cheated it so that it's just a simple gradient, but it's pretty convincing. Like, you can tell what that is. You know that there's some sort of fire there that's probably high intensity, and it's the same thing with his feet. And you also notice that the gradient that's closer to you I made darker, and the one that's further away less so, and that's just because I knew as something's further away, the more blue, the more gray, the less you know, black or dark it's going to be. So I kind of completely skipped over that part where I was doing the closer building, where you can see these purples. That's just throwing blue on. Shadows are typically blue and more saturated. When you paint them, highlights are closer to yellow and white. So for that one, I was just basically throwing in where I knew there would be shadows. And I didn't really do it on the building opposite, because if the light is in the upper left, that side of the building on this left side building, the one I'm working on now, is just in shadow. It is the shadow side of the building. So here, all I'm really having to account for is just like those lentils, the windowsill and the top of the window. I don't know what that top part's called. Not off the top of my head. If they're a different color than the brick, then I just need to kind of tweak the color a little bit. But if I can't remember where I picked it up, but I watched something where they were talking about, you know, when you're dealing with things that are in shadow or on the shadow side of something, usually what happens is your eye will pick up the difference in color, but not a lot, because things will kind of meld into that same color, and the deeper the shadow, the more that everything is the same color. And so really with this, it's just sort of like tweaking the color wheel and kind of maybe tweaking it a little bit towards blue or a little bit towards red, or you know, something like that, to just give it a little bit different, but not so much that it was super obvious. And I also didn't want to draw attention. If you put a huge contrast on something, like, I don't know, putting a super white on top of like a really dark black or something like that, it draws the eye, and so you do have to be careful with that stuff, especially when you're doing background stuff. Because if you want your focus to be on Captain America, you can't be throwing a whole bunch of things like that. Yeah, these I bumped up the color just because I knew if the light's coming in, it's going to hit it, you know, and there's glass, shattered glass, that's going to reflect the light a little bit more. Also, the background was looking, I don't want to say bland, but it didn't have quite as much going on as I wanted it to. And I wanted there to be some interest. This is poster size. The final product is a full-size poster. And so I wanted to make sure that, you know, that was okay, and it didn't feel like I just like cheaped out on the background. I didn't care. So here we go, finally doing some shadows and stuff. I actually think I ditched this one. So, little backstory. After I did this, or shortly after I did this, I switched jobs, and still similar work, but much more intense, and haven't had time to record the video because everybody's at work from home, which includes my wife. And so right now I am recording this with the door closed, and it's late, and I'm hoping that she doesn't walk in here for some reason or another, and my son is asleep in the other room, and hopefully he doesn't wake up and scream at me, because I'll have to pause recording. But yes, sorry, I was working on different shadow tools and trying to find one that I actually liked, and that's kind of what happened there. Is I was like, that looks stupid. I like things that look like they were crafted. There are some super talented artists out there who can craft you a image that is lifelike, and you couldn't tell it from a photograph. And I have a huge amount of respect for them. But my personal taste and preference is I like things that look like they were crafted or drawn. I like sketches. I love sketches. I love things that have grit to them. Like, to me, like, I just love those things. Even when I was a kid, like, you know, I would buy an art book from a store, and I would want those art books to be like the sketchbook, because I always found that more interesting, and you know, it helped me more to see sort of the base version before it went through like 17 other artists and they finally got their final version. And so for this, I was looking for a brush that still kind of had that grit to it, that was still interesting. And then that was kind of the brush that I used to do the rest of the shadows and things like that. And I think that's another point for you people who might be jumping into this kind of stuff. If you're new to digital or you want to start, it's important to find brushes you like that sort of fit into the style that you like. And once you start a piece with those brushes, if those are your brushes, use them for the whole thing. Be really careful about changing it up too much. Mixed media is cool and all. Nothing against mixed media, especially people who do like a ton of mixed media. But be careful with it, because especially in digital, because a lot of those brushes will interact in very strange ways, and you'll get things that you really just like, you'll end up screwing up a piece towards the end, and nothing sucks worse than that. Merge the wrong layer and save, and then you're just like, oh, what have I done? So and it doesn't always have to be the same thing, but like, for me, there's in ClipStudio specifically, there's like one brush I use when I do line stuff. It's called the Real G brush, and I use it because it has a little bit of grit to it. It's not a perfectly round brush, which I've mentioned many times. I would stay away from those unless you have a real specific need for it, because it makes your stuff look really static. But when you start doing color, or you start throwing in color, find another brush to use that you like, but then kind of stick with that one. You might use another brush to like do more blurs, or maybe has like a nicer opacity or something, but try not to get too crazy with the number of brushes you use, just because it can do some weird things, and you'll probably get frustrated with it. Get proficient in a couple of things before you just start jumping the shark and trying to get good with everything. So yeah, again, layer masks. Well, actually, technically that's not a mask. I just used the selection tool, but did it just put some shine on the shield. Foreground hand. Like I said, I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of how the hand turned out, but I also know it's not a focal point. It is kind of in that rule of thirds. I think his knee right there, I'm pretty sure, is at one of the thirds. His sort of throwing hand leg there occupies the other. So that hand's pretty close. I would say that Cap's throwing hand is probably priority one. It's like the most interesting thing that's directed towards the viewer. The hand and the shield kind of make up sort of the second focal point. And I haven't added the third one yet, but there's a ship at the top that's going to get added. And I think that one's going to serve as the... Oh yeah, so I was going to add this, and I struggled with it because I wasn't sure I wanted it to be a logo. But that space felt really empty. And so I kept messing with it, and eventually I actually pinged a group of friends, non-artists, or people who dabble, but they don't draw like I do, to ask for feedback. And this is super important. What I would say is to newer people, you can ask anyone for feedback. It doesn't take a great artist to call you out on stuff. And so I was doing stuff like this. And I just couldn't get it to work the way I wanted to. Like, it just always felt forced and weird. And typography, I took graphic design in college, and I will say, people who do type, hats off to you guys. It is scary hard. Doing this stuff by hand is scary hard. This was the best success I had, by the way, is doing that sort of gradient, which I actually was the only one that I was like, that actually kind of works. But even then, it felt like a cereal box kind of thing. It was weird. This was actually something else one of them recommended, was putting in some sort of lines for the shield throw, which I thought was a good idea. So I ended up doing a real simple sort of like try to blur. That's what that was. And then I ended up doing this sort of red swoosh. because the edge of the shield is red, so if it's tracking through the air, what you're probably going to see is the red. Wasn't super harsh with it, because I didn't want it to, you know, be this red blotch, and I certainly didn't want it to obscure the cool gradient effect behind it. But yeah, I was like trying this over and over and over again. Like, yeah, I even did this outline. I think that's probably the highest level of success I got, because I still wanted it to look hand drawn, but I had the hardest time. And yes, I probably could have gone and found like the perfect like Captain America font, or like stolen the logo or something, but I didn't want to do something that cheeky. And so I was just having such a time with it. But the thought that crossed my mind is, she knows who this character is, and I know who this character is, and probably anybody who's going to look at this picture knows who this character is. And if they don't, they will ask one of the people standing near them, which will be myself, my wife, or somebody who knows us pretty well. So I don't think I need the name. But I will also say, I do think that this styling actually turned out pretty well, despite the fact I ended up not using it. But I did end up ditching it specifically because I put in, you'll see it later, but the shield ship behind that, and that kind of served as my third focal point. And you know, when you're doing these scene pieces, you do kind of want to think about how many focal points you have. You can have thousands, but people are usually only going to recognize the first couple, unless they sit there staring at the piece for a super long time. And well, I will admit, there are still places where color bleeds weird in this, where maybe I missed a line. You know, the white bleeds into the blue across a line where it probably shouldn't have. Oh yeah, highlights from the fire. That also really helped pop him out a little bit. It also gave it a little bit more of a cartoony feel, but again, kind of okay with that. But you know, it's just, you got to think about what people are going to see when they look at your thing, and for me it was, I usually when I'm planning a scene, I want 3 focal points, somewhere around the rule of thirds, and to work towards that. And see, this is when I was looking at it, I was like, that actually looks pretty good. Wasn't crazy about the first Avenger thing in yellow, but that's a lot of comic books, they use yellow because it tends to stand out against whatever they have in the background. Same thing with that drop shadow, which is kind of cheesy. But I was actually, this was almost the version that I went with. This was pretty close to me just being like, nope, that's good, let's print it. Yeah, I tried changing the text and playing around with it a little bit more, but I think ultimately it was probably a better call to just put something else in there, and put a little more action in the background. That was the other thing that I felt I was kind of missing, is that sorry, that got really small because I minimized it for a second. Is that Cap looks pretty decent there, and active, but there wasn't actually a lot of action going on in the background. Like, you have the ships flying, but they're not interacting with anything. You have that dude on the weird alien thing on the top, but he's not doing anything. He's just being scary. You know, that building has already blown up. It's not blowing up. And so I looked up a bunch of different designs for shield helicarriers, which, by the way, there are so many of these. Just so many. So many. All different designs. There doesn't seem like there's anything unifying. And often not shot, very few pictures from the bottom. Maybe it's because they go invisible usually when they're like that. So I ended up just kind of getting something that would look like I'd be identifiable as a sort of helicarrier, which is where I came up with this thing. The biggest thing that seems to define a helicarrier when people look at it is the giant windmill turbines on the side. The heli and helicarrier, if you will. And so that's kind of what those are. And me failing at them badly because I was having trouble drawing them in. So I actually ended up going with like jet propulsion. But I did get to do things like put little cannons on the side and have like a little hangar and things like that. And then that's me just obscuring the part that's in the smoke because it would be harder to see. Adding some detail, and then I ended up adding some ships and actually putting in some like lasers, because that's, you know, a thing you want the helicarriers to be firing in comic books is lasers, because they're safe. And so yeah, like, again, you'll notice that my layer count is like stupid. And should I have combined them? Yes. But I don't often do these kind of pieces that are quite this crazy, and you know, have this much going on. And I was phobic of combining something and not being able to, you know, fix it later, which is a foible of mine. I will say in digital, you can always fix it later. Like, I've long since passed the part where I'm like, oh, this hand isn't great. Oh, let me make a new layer and redraw the hand. I just straight up erase the hand, because thankfully I've developed the confidence of like, I can draw that better and I will draw that better, and just let me show you. So that's kind of where I've come up to it. This is kind of winding down at this point, I will admit. You know, me doing lots of checks and just kind of like, does this look right? Does this look okay? So thank you all. For anybody who has been watching, I'll sit here and kind of finish this out. I'm sorry I don't have one of me doing my son's piece. Tessa, I love you. I hope we all have a Merry Christmas, and I hope you enjoyed if you watched the entire video to get to this very, very end. Maybe next year I will think about doing Thor, or maybe that'll be a birthday thing. I don't know. Maybe you will hate Thor by then, but we'll figure it out. So, again, I love you, and good night.